just riff on this for a second. Is there waste, fraud, and abuse? Are there specific things that we can cut in the Department of Defense budget? What a loaded question, Charlie. Yeah, I just think so. The first is the so-called National Military Strategy, which you could rename the National Interventionist Strategy. You don't really have a defense strategy. So the first thing you gotta do is develop a new national military strategy. Point number 1, declare that you are not going to be interventionist. We're not going to interfere in the affairs of other people. Secondly, we're not going to insist that our allies join us in future interventions. We're going to tell you lies. Look, in the event of war, you've got to be your own first responder. This notion of maintaining huge forces overseas to reassure people on other continents is a disaster. Technology has changed now. If you put a lot of forces, particularly on the ground, forward in any of the theaters, you're going to lose them because we have this thing called precision strike, and the Russians, Chinese, Indians, you name it. Everybody on the planet now has access to the microcircuitry for that. And the next thing you've got to do is understand that this military establishment that Graham wants to desperately protect hasn't really been subject to fundamental overhaul and reform for 50 years. So you're staring at an enormous dinosaur, and then underpinning the dinosaur are hundreds of programs that are supposed to provide more capability, and in reality, these things haven't had much value since they were first conceived of, and many of them have dragged on for 20 or 30 years. They become feeding programs for people like Graham and his friends on the Hill. So the bottom line is, sure, you can do all of those things, and then after you've made the basic changes in your strategy, you gotta go after the overhead. Charlie, we have 44 four-star generals and admirals for a force of only $1.1 million. Now, during World War II, when we had 12.2 million men under arms, we only had 74 stars. $12 billion a day, we have such a powerful point, and that is starting to interrupt, but that is parallel to exactly what's happened in our education system, where we're so heavy on administrators and the administrative state. The bureaucracy far outweighs the actual rank and file boots that are actually doing the work. It's a really powerful point. Oh, no, absolutely. Then you have to also ask the question, how many of the people that we have on active duty can actually deploy and fight if they have to do it? But the top issue is this first issue, which is you stop the interventionism and then make it clear that we are going to defend the United States, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. You know we've got people all over the world. Why? We're not under immediate threat of invasion. We should be concerned about what's happening in our own hemisphere. And the only place where there is an invasion ongoing, as you know, is down in the southern place where we don't have troops. We have military bases in every nook and cranny you can imagine, but 10,000 illegals are able to waltz into our country every day. Yeah, absolutely, and this is something else that we need to keep in mind. People like Lindsey Graham and all of his supporters, everybody on the Hill, in fact, all the four stars, all understand that the bloated force establishment, the bloated overhead, the bloated budget is all tied to overseas expenditure. That's the problem. In other words, you try to get an army general interested in protecting the southern border of the United States. He looks at you, why? How do I finance modernization programs of questionable value if all I'm doing is defending America? I mean, that's what you're going to get from these people. How do I justify my bloated rank structure and all these useless headquarters unless I'm fighting somebody overseas? One of the people I talked to that was involved was a U.S. senator, and I called him. I said, "What is going on with this?" He said, "Charlie, you know, off the record, don't say my name, but you could say the essence of this is that the people involved, Lindsey Graham and his allies in the Senate, were telling McCarthy and were telling him we're not going to vote for this, and Colonel, they were saying we don't have ammunition, we do not have missiles, that our stockpiles are depleted, that we need new everything, and I just without actually having been in the military, just looking at this as a civilian taxpayer, I know this is rubbish. This is we spend the chart you could put up on screen. We spend about $800 billion for our defense budget, but it's probably more than that, and that is more than Brazil, South Korea, Japan, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Saudi Arabia, Russia, India, and China combined. I mean, Colonel, I refuse to believe that we need an $800 billion spend every single year and somehow Lindsey Graham is able to convince people that our munition stockpiles are being depleted. What is the truth? Well, he's right, but the reason our stockpiles are depleted is that for a very long time, we haven't had to prepare for a real war. Everyone forgets that the opponents that we face since 2001 have all been weak. Haven't had any armies or air forces or navies or real capability at all. You're facing people with AK-47s and automated mines and so forth. In other words, there's nothing organized out there to fight. Now, we've depleted what stocks we had because we shipped them over to Europe for use by the Ukrainians, and we've rapidly run out because we were never prepared to begin with to fight a real war. Remember, the whole defense is credited on the notion that somehow or another there's no one in the world that can challenge us. That we're the best. We're the toughest. And by the way, we are going to spend lavishly on all sorts of wonder weapons. Miracle weapons that will do wonderful things against any enemy. All of that is nonsense. But it puts a lot of money into people's pockets on the Hill. Remember, you support the defense industries. Their lobbyists are going to reward you. Your political action committees support you for re-election. They're going to have millions of dollars at their disposal. HM. And there are also foreign lobbies involved in this. Because there are foreign lobbies that don't want you to leave the area, they're interested in leveraging us for their own strategic purposes. It's the old tail wags the dog problem. We've got that problem all over the world right now. Can you give some examples of some? I mean, Ukraine and Russia's an obvious one, but we showed the picture of how many military bases we have. These are military bases, not embassies. I mean, for example, we have 25,000 troops in South Korea. Okay, you might be able to make an argument, but the troops in Peru or the troops in Africa, and we have them scattered all across the planet, I should say, and Republicans, Colonel, enter into these negotiations with zero willingness to consider any sort of cuts or any sort of adjustments. Colonel, how do you think these negotiations should have been handled from just a leadership standpoint? Well, let me give you two quick answers. The first thing, you mentioned South Korea. In the 1990s, after Desert Storm, people went back and looked at our war plans for the Korean Peninsula. It was very clear that in the event of an attack, even though then it was very unlikely, all of the aid and assistance that we would provide to the Koreans would come largely from the Navy and the Air Force. So, the question was, why are we going to use the Army then? The Army was not terribly interested in Korea. They had bigger fish to fry at the time, they thought, in the Middle East and elsewhere. Finally, Colin Powell interrupted and said, well, we'll maintain a little army force there to maintain a foothold, and then we'll make the reinforcement for Korea the Marine Corps mission. Because nobody could find anything for the Marine Corps to do. Which, by the way, is a problem right now. So these are not new issues. And the generals are always trying to find workarounds to satisfy both themselves and congressional interests to keep the money. So, that's the first part of the question that needs to be answered. The second is McCarthy and the so-called Republicans should have stood their ground. They should say, fine. We're not going to vote for it. They should have stonewalled. And when everybody says, well, you know, if you do that, we might default. Well, I've got news for everybody. That's going to happen eventually anyway. We cannot service a $31, $32, $33 trillion debt. It can't be done over the long haul. We as well act now, make the hard cuts, make the hard decision. Because postponing it means that there'll probably be an attempt to try and inflate our way out, which I don't think is going to work. It could easily ruin and destroy our currency completely, which is already a threat. And then we're in a far worse crisis than anything we face today. Today, we could make prudent changes. No one wants to do it. No one wants the pain. The American people don't want the pain. And so their representatives say, look, I can't do that. I'm going to make all my supporters unhappy. It's remarkable, and our audience is not having it. I mean, regular, ordinary grassroots folks, they see it. Admiral Mullen, who I've mixed opinions about, 10 years ago was correct. He said the greatest national security risk is the national debt. He said, and that was when the national debt was $10 or $11 trillion. It is now triple that. I mean, you can only, not to mention the unfunded liabilities, the pension obligations, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, you can't touch the defense budget. Boy, if you wanted to destroy the country, if you wanted to see America fall, this is what you would do. You would turn on the guzzle of cheap money and erode the currency. Colonel, I'd like to have you elaborate a little bit more on how the national debt is a serious threat to our national security more so than Vladimir Putin. I mean, I don't think Putin is much of a threat to America at all, but the consensus in D.C. is Putin is far more of a threat than the lack of spending discipline. Your reaction? Well, you've been spending recklessly for decades. You'll use whatever you can find to justify its continuation. That's the sad truth right now. That's why it was so important for the so-called Republicans to stand their ground and say, come what may, this is not going to go any further, we're going to stop it. Unfortunately, they let everybody down. I think that the debt has always been threatening because it threatened to reduce the influx of dollars to defense, and that's very true. But it only works and it's only a threat if the people in charge will behave prudently, and they're not going to behave prudently. They're going to push us over the abyss. I'm afraid that we're going to live in an environment very shortly that is close to 1929, 30, and 31. An environment we helped to create. Right now in St. Petersburg, Russia, there is a plan to bring together 84 countries. That's right, all of whom want to adopt gold as the standard for currency. They want to set up a new currency. And Russia, China, and India, who quite frankly at this point control most of the world's gold, are leading the charge, and they're all going to join them because they want to get out from under us. We're bankrupting everybody else. When you spend dollars and you give other people your dollar, you're passing on our debt. They don't want to deal with it anymore. If 84 countries come to an agreement on gold, and let's just say there's still a lot of steps in the middle, and they say, hey, we no longer want the dollar to be the world reserve currency. Guess where those dollars go? They immediately get sent back to the United States. You will have 20 to 30% inflation. Is that correct, Colonel? Oh, I think so, and you're going to watch everybody dump the U.S. treasuries. Bingo! That's the fire sale that we should all be concerned about when the treasuries are sold off overseas. That's the beginning of the end for our financial domination, and frankly, it probably should end at this point because we bullied the dickens out of the whole world for years. Do what we say or we're going to harm you. We're going to sanction you. We've got 35 countries under sanctions right now. It's lunacy. And I don't want to over-exaggerate, but the involvement of the war in eastern Ukraine seems to be the centerpiece that is putting this cause set in motion. Right? It's almost the cause set in motion as we involve ourselves in eastern Ukraine around a NATO project that then destabilizes the dollar that could create a retreat from our ability to have world reserve currency status. Now, Colonel, this might be a bridge too far, and feel free to disagree, but today is the first day of Pride Month and NATO and the military are embracing this, with evangelistic zeal. In fact, part of the mantra as to why NATO says we must defeat Putin is that we in the West embrace outward celebration of LGBTQIA+ values and Putin does not. Is it fair to say that part of this war in eastern Ukraine is a proxy war over social values? Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that. But let's just remember something that Americans easily forget. The United States military establishment exists for one reason, and that is to kill the enemies of the American people, to defend this country. That's why we have it. It is not there to spread equity, diversity, inclusiveness. It's not there to establish equality all over the world. It's not there to establish democracy, which quite frankly increasingly looks like a joke here at home in our country. Why don't we bring some democracy here? Yeah, of course, like good luck. I mean, not indicting former presidents, for example. Well, yeah, but look, what are we going to do in future elections when everybody's filling out a ballot 16 times over and stuffing it into boxes? I mean, how do you have free and fair elections when there's no election integrity? This is the big issue. So all the focus overseas diverts us, obviously. But there's one other aspect to this thing. There are people in Eastern Europe, like the Poles, for instance, who are very interested in leveraging our power to fight their old enemy Russia. The question I have is, why should we be interested? Bingo! Russia presents no threat to us. Russia is a Russian Orthodox Christian country with a national identity and history. It has nothing to do with why we should be there right now. Colonel Douglas Macgregor provides an incredibly clear and powerful analysis. I wish we had more time. By the way, there's a clip I wish we could play. Senator Graham is saying that he's upset that this bill does not include more money. You can't make this stuff up. June, July, and August, this is going to be the hot summer of indictments where they're going to try to take Donald Trump off the political chessboard. They are going to try to use extra-constitutional, non-democratic means to interfere with the election, to try to baselessly indict him either in Georgia or the Department of Justice. They already have the New York City one brewing, and yesterday was a little bit of a warning shot. It was a harbinger, canary in the coal mine exclusive from CNN.com. Trump captured on tape talking about classified documents he kept after leaving the White House. Make no mistake, they're going to try to interfere with your Republican primary by using indictments, half-baked legal theories. And to help us understand this and to respond is Alina Hava, one of President Trump's attorneys, who does a wonderful job. Alina, welcome to the program. Your response to CNN's article that was published yesterday? Thanks for having me, Charlie. It's always a pleasure. My response is that the leaks kind of indicate exactly what you said, that they're gearing up to again figure out a way to keep him out of the race, to make sure that the people don't get an option and to interfere with an election. This is something that we've seen happen. The whole boxes hoax, for lack of a better word, is something that we've seen happen through numerous presidents and, Obama, Clinton's, but with Donald Trump and an election brewing, we're seeing something completely different and unheard of. So, I haven't heard the tape. I can guess what it says, and I'm assuming it's nothing highly relevant, but they'll make it that way. Yeah, they're going to try to misrepresent things. Can you just talk about more broadly about a legal strategy that is being, embraced right now? 'Cause it feels as if they're trying to take the president out from every direction. You got New York City, Georgia, the DOJ deal, and who leaked this? Look, that's who they are. They leak things for a reason. They're trying to move the Overton window. What is the posture and the plan right now that you're taking in the defense of the president? Unfortunately, I should say fortunately, they've come at him so hard, and they're coming after the president so obviously, right, Charlie? But in that it's hard for the American people to see what they're doing. So, in terms of PR, that bit is a little bit easier. Left-wing media is obvious, and we have a conflicting storyline. In terms of legal strategy, we have to deal with each and every one of them differently. We are given indictments, as you saw with the DA in New York, that are intentionally vague, that take something that is not a felony and crank it up to a felony. We have something like declassifying documents, which, we have the Presidential Records Act. We've had every president come in and out and have this issue, but they'll again crank it up. So it's about making new case law and going after each and every one of them individually. We're going to, like you said, they're going to try indicting. They're going to try and keep indicting and just make sure our job is to make sure that we keep him out of any serious trouble. And the truth of the matter is there are trials. Indictments don't mean you're guilty. It's a charge, and then you have to go to trial, and the evidence will speak for itself. So here's a question, Alina. Who has the ultimate authority on classifications? That seems to be at the essence of this. The president is the only person that can declassify a document without, and this is not my case. I should always say that I'm a lawyer, and I'm going to give you my waiver and caveat, but this is not my case, obviously. I'm close to the president and I handle many cases for him, but it's common knowledge that the president does have the ability to declassify documents single-handedly. Yeah, so basically, just by a decree, he could declassify anything, right? And so, that's right, and the case law is a little bit, opaque here. He could just say, oh, this is declassified. There's really not a committee, there's not a process. No. And I think that's exactly it. I think that if we were Americans again, we would say, look, this has happened so many times between so many presidents. We keep seeing these hiccups, and then Nero has to come back and do this. To me, that's a waste of resources. So I think as Americans, instead of trying to indict people who are leading in the polls, what we should be doing is saying, okay, this is a consistent issue. We want to obviously preserve records. We want to make sure that there's nothing classified that we don't want out there, even though the president has this right. Maybe we need to reevaluate the fact that every president has gotten into a situation where there's a back and forth in communication, right? And that's what we need to do. So I think that's a little bit more productive, frankly, than going after an election integrity situation in this country. But there are not so many like-minded people for our country right now that are leading the charge in DA's and AG's offices. Yeah, so the Records Act, you look at Obama, you look at Biden, you look at all these people and they just say, oh yeah, we declassify, we're able to bring boxes of stuff, and the DOJ is there looking for everything they possibly can, either the January 6th stuff, which again, you very well might, and Alina, I want your just broad big picture here, I want to make sure the audience is ready. We might see separate federal indictments, yeah, January 6th stuff. What should we prepare for? Because to take the surprise element off the table is important. What do you think we should prepare for? I think you should prepare for exactly what we saw in the New York DA. I think that if we sit here and we think they're going to have a moment of wow, this might not be good for the country. Wow, we're kind of exacerbating. Let's not do this. Let's not hold our breath for that. I think your listeners are very well educated thanks to you and the guests you bring on, and I think we have to be realistic. We are in a situation where the Republican Party, where right-wing conservative religious minds or anything like that, are under siege in this country, whether it be what we're seeing with children, with the woke generation, with Target, with all these things. And I can't sit here and tell your people, hey, we're good, everything's fine. We're not fine. The country is seeing a very serious school system of justice, and if we don't start thinking that this is what's happening like you said, we're not going to be prepared. But I can tell you one thing, Charlie, his legal team is prepared. We always expect the worst because that's how they treat him, very unfairly and very differently, frankly, like you said, than any other president. So they should expect that the DOJ is going to continue to be weaponized until he gets back in office, if he can, and the only way he's not going to get back in is if there's corruption because his poll numbers say it all, So we really need him to come in and save the country, otherwise, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble. It is conceivable that at President Trump's convention speech 14 months from now in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that he could be under 4 separate indictments. Yes. And is that realistic, Alina? In the world that we're in the culture we're in, unfortunately, I could see that. I'm not on these cases, and I could never say, but yeah, of course. Yep. And he's already under indictment. One's enough. It's ridiculous. So yeah, no, I'm not going to tell you it's impossible. You can't imagine that it would happen. It already did, and it should just charge up the voters more, frankly, and people should be waking up now. We're leading with this story for a reason, and we're going to get into the dead stuff because the audience is fired up about this. We're leading this for a reason, Alina, because we're entering into the summer where we have a very pro-Trump audience, very MAGA, and you cannot be taken by surprise to understand that there is this extra-constitutional creature out there of the Leviathan that uses the ability to indict political opponents Soviet style to their advantage. This is going to be the summer of lawfare. It's not the summer of love, it's the summer of lawfare. they're going to go after Trump in a very serious way. By Labor Day, summer, quote unquote, it usually goes from Memorial Day to Labor Day. It is my anticipation, and I say this with great disappointment in our legal system, that by Labor Day, Donald Trump could be experiencing some incredibly unfair, unconstitutional, and quite honestly indictments.